For sure. So another
Oh,
article that I took months to write, which was like pretty awesome and fun, was the top 25 video games from the 1990s. You both grew up in the 90s, I assume?
Yep.
actually, I was born in 1991, but didn't grow up until just recently.
Yeah, fair
Today?
enough. And you also in 1991?
Yep.
Wow, that's interesting. So we're looking at the top games from the 90s, which I think is like one of the best eras in video games for a couple reasons. One, I think it's when like Nintendo was really trying hard. And so we got some really classic high quality games because they were competing with Sega. And two, we also had this like evolution of technology that went from like the birth of games in the 2D phase to like the maturity of games in that awkward adult phase when they were just introducing 3D. So they had to get really creative with it. So I'll just like, what I'll do is I'll go through the list real quick. And then maybe you guys, we can talk about some games that, well, what games would you guys put at the top as the top games from the 1990s? And Em, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I can tell you what some of my favorite games from the 90s were. First one, Mickey Mania on Sega Genesis.
Mickey, can you tell us a bit about Mickey Mania?
Mickey Mania was amazing. Best game ever. Do I have any? I feel like Spyro was pretty up there for me too.
Spyro made my list for sure. I will admit Mickey Mania was not on my list.
That's because you were mistaken. But in the 90s, I played a lot of 80s games, so I feel like a lot of them I just wasn't really familiar with.
Fair enough. Okay. And Steven, what are some games you think should be
Well, Gex for one.
what about Banjo Kazooie?
Banjo Kazooie can. Fuck Banjo Kazooie. Not even that good of a game.
Any other games you'd like to put on your list of top 90s games?
Crash Bandicoot, the first Crash Bandicoot.
Yeah. I like the idea of Crash Bandicoot because Crash became like the PlayStation mascot for a little bit, right? He was kind of like he was kind of like the anti Mario, and they even had like campaigns. It was funny too because PlayStation was always like stop comparing Crash to Mario, but then their whole campaign was like, "Hey, plumber boy," and it's like you're directly competing with Mario.
Yeah, exactly.
It made no sense. But I'll just quickly go through the list a little bit for our listeners and for our YouTubers. And then we can debate whether it's a stupid list, as most gamers like to point out, or if it's a fantastic list that I think is awesome. All right, number one, Super Mario World from the 1990s. Also, these weren't in any sort of ranking order. These were just in chronological order, the order by release.
Oh, so you did them in order of release?
Yeah. So there wouldn't be some crazy debate about like, oh, you got this game above that game. Like it's impossible to rank some of these games.
17 and it should have been an 18. How could you?
It's like, all right, guys, calm down. Like, all right, so Super Mario World, 1990, classic. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, 1991, fantastic game. Sonic the Hedgehog, 1991. Mortal Kombat, 1992. Doom, 1993. Super Metroid, 1994, awesome game. Donkey Kong Country, 1994. I put Warcraft 1 and 2 because Warcraft kind of introduced us to the world of Azeroth and really like started that whole, like it's the reason why World of Warcraft is a thing. But then Warcraft 2 kind of like perfected it and it was like a much better game. So I put them both on there. Pokemon Red and Blue version, Super Mario 64, which came out in 1996. Mario Kart 64, Resident Evil, the original Resident Evil, Crash Bandicoot, Diablo, which came out in 1996, GoldenEye, 1997, Final Fantasy 7. A lot of people, I had some arguments on the weekend about Final Fantasy 7 versus Final Fantasy 6, if either you care about that. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, fantastic game. Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, StarCraft, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, which is awesome. Metal Gear Solid, Half-Life, Super Smash Bros., and Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. All right. What do we think of the list? And we'll start with you, Steven.
I think that Mario does not. Well, no. Okay, you know what? Super Mario Brothers is fine up until like
3.
Mario Sunshine. After that, they were garbage. But that's another discussion for another day.
So are you disagreeing with Super Mario World with being on there?
Yeah, I'd say Super Mario 3 is probably the best one.
Okay, all right. When did that come out? I don't even know.
1990.
Really? Release date. Super Mario World is the game that got me into video games, so I'm like No, Super Mario 3 came out in 1988.
In Japan.
So
Okay,
wouldn't
but
have
it
even
grew
made the
up.
list.
Okay, it grew up in the 90s though.
That's what I'm saying is that like I grew up on an NES with all the games my dad bought in the 80s. So like Mario, original Mario, Mario 3,
That's
Duck
fair
Hunt.
enough, yeah. And I grew up with Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, so like I'm like fully into the 90s and N64 and PlayStation and stuff. I don't know. It
When
was
I
a
go-
really good time. Like it was really great too because I just bought the Super NES Classic that came out, so I got to revisit like a lot of these games. And what's crazy to me is one, how many Nintendo games are on here because they just dominated the 90s, and two was how many of these games like still hold up today. Like you can play through Super Mario World or you can play through A Link to the Past, and it'd still be like a fantastic game that some indie developer could have come out with tomorrow and it would win awards.
I Go ahead. Em.
Oh, I was gonna say I started playing Mario Kart, the 64 version, on my Switch, and I wanted to murder everyone.
See, I feel like games on the Super Nintendo aged really well.
Yeah, I think so.
64, aside from like a select few, did not.
No, absolutely not. No. And like whenever the rare replay collection came out, I think that became very apparent. Whenever you'd play Banjo Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day, you're like, oh my God, the controls and the camera angles in this are awful. It was meant for that awkward like N64 type controller. One game that I was like when I was going through this, I was like super pumped about it was Mortal Kombat because we had released an article, or we released, I think we did a Boss Fight Friday on violence in video games. And like in researching Mortal Kombat, that's like the game that started it all. When Mortal Kombat came out, the US government was trying to ban it because it was too violent. It was saying children playing it were too violent. But what was also cool about it was Mortal Kombat also like became this giant franchise that had like movies and comic books and all these cool things and like such a stamp in pop culture, I would say. So Mortal Kombat was a game I was really excited to put on this list.
For a while, the Mortal Kombat theme song was my ringtone on my phone.
Did it start off with like fight? Dun, 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 dun.
It started off with like yeah.
Or did it just go into Mortal Kombat?
Yeah, it was that. It was that. It was definitely that. And it went off during a work meeting one time. And it was very awkward.
That's awesome.
My
I'll probably cut this part. I'll probably cut this part from the podcast, but there's one time where we were in a work meeting and we had a client and we were like, we need your password to get onto your website or something like that. And without even blinking, he was like, oh, the password is doggy fuck. And my boss awkwardly laughed because he thought it was a joke. And then the guy repeated doggy fuck. It was the most awkward matter of fact thing that's ever happened to me. It was so
But
weird.
no one's ever going to guess that.
Exactly. It was so funny. And he's like this dirtbag lawyer too. It was really funny.
Oh boy.
That's on brand.
Yeah. Another game. Did you guys ever play Donkey Kong Country?
No, never my entire life.
So the cool thing about Donkey Kong Country was back in the early 90s, Nintendo had such a rough battle with Sega that they were actually like hurting. I think there was that video game crash that happened as well. And so like video games in general were kind of getting a bad rap, especially with the Mortal Kombat stuff. So like video game sales in general were hurting, and Donkey Kong Country was the game that like made gamers come back to the Super NES and actually single-handedly saved Nintendo as a company. That's just like a super fun fact trivia about like Nintendo and Donkey Kong Country when I was like doing my research about it. It was really awesome.
I didn't know that you could give me a reason to hate Donkey Kong Country.
Okay, so what would you put as like the top, like what would be your number one 90s game?
Metal Gear Solid.
You think Metal Gear Solid? That's a pretty
Yeah.
that's a pretty solid choice.
Story-wise, yes. Story-wise, that game holds up. Gameplay-wise, not so much.
Not so much, eh?
Like I played they just put the HD collection of Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 on Xbox
Yeah.
Game Pass, and I tried to go back and replay Metal Gear Solid 2, and oh my god, fun.
Yeah. And what about you? What's your top 90s game?
I think I'd say Spyro, just because for the next generation, that inspired most of the games that I played
Yeah. Mhm.
a long period of time.
Spyro was a cool choice too, because you had Mario, who was jumping around. You had Banjo Kazooie that was kind of like same as Mario, but had some flying mechanics. And Spyro was kind of just like all flying, which was pretty cool. People are like just getting used to the whole 3D space, and to add like flight into that was like pretty cool. I would say my top game coming out of the 90s, it was really tough because like Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past are just like two awesome timeless games that like just, and same with Breath of the Wild too. Like those three games to me are just like the epitome of gaming. But Pokemon Red and Blue, I thought established like a giant, enormous billion-dollar franchise, and like there's like nothing more iconic than Pokemon, except Kylie Jenner. It's Pikachu or Kylie Jenner. It's one of the other guys.
Kylie Jenner, Pikachu, everything else.
So, guys, if you have any opinions at home about what you think the top 90s games are, you can comment below in the video, or you can head over to our Twitter and you can yell at me about how terrible my list is, or about how fantastic you think the list is. If there's any games that you think I missed, you can comment below the article and let me know, because I'm very open to changing my list. And there's also one other game that I really wanted to talk about, and that was Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. That was the last game I put on there, and it's super random, but it comes from a time when like The Phantom Menace came out and it was absolutely terrible, but Lucasfilms was still really good at like making video games, and every racing game that had come out after Mario Kart was just a complete copy of Mario Kart, like Diddy Kong Racing and Crash Team Racing and stuff. So Episode 1 Racer was like the first racing game to come out that was like completely different. It was awesome. It was fast paced. The levels were super interesting because they were like different planets from the Star Wars universe, and you could also use characters from the Star Wars universe and like upgrade your ship and stuff. So I thought that game was like absolutely like had to be on the list, and that's my opinion on that.